The Falcons finally hired their defensive coordinator, and it's ex-Saints D-line coach and co-defensive coordinator Ryan Nielsen. We'll talk about the personnel and schematic changes we can expect for the Falcons defense and talk about all the free agents that the Falcons are going to now lure to Atlanta this offseason.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the most humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, who are going to help you find the candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. And guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube and you get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And make sure you check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV as part of Locked On Sports Atlanta. Just download the Locked On Sports Atlanta app and you'll get Locked On Falcons on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So guys, we are breaking in. I'm recording this late Friday night for an emergency pod where the Falcons finally hired their defensive coordinator, and they also weakened the New Orleans Saints, which makes me so very happy. Hiring Ryan Nielsen, the former Saints D-line coach who had been promoted this past year as co-defensive coordinator along with Chris Richard, kind of like the run game coordinator, I guess you could say, with Richard probably handling more of the passing game given his background as his defensive backs coach. And now he is going to be the Falcons' new defensive coordinator, replacing Dean Pease. There were several other coaching changes that we will sort of see how the Falcons fill out the rest of their coaching staff over the coming days with that in line. But the Falcons have their defensive coordinator, and we were waiting for this, and we were hoping to see this before, they went down to Las Vegas to coach in the Shrine Bowl, and they got their guy. And Nielsen's kind of on the younger side, similar age as Arthur Smith at 43, played defensive tackle at USC back in the late 90s. Ed Orgeron was his position coach while he was there, did play some Arena League football before he got into coaching, going from Ole Miss to Central Connecticut State, which I think was the only place where he was listed as a defensive coordinator and presumably took all of the play calling duties. Then went to UT Martin, Northern Illinois. Then he became the D-line coach at NC State in 2013 and stuck there through 2016, where they happened to also hire a certain offensive line coach named Dwayne Ledford, who's now with the Atlanta Falcons. So I imagine, Nielsen became on, Arthur Smith's radar in part due to, Dwayne Ledford saying like, yeah, he's a really good coach and really challenged my guys on the offensive side of the ball, certainly on the defensive side of the ball. And while he was at NC State, he put a lot of guys into the NFL. T.Y. McGill, Bradley Chubb, Kentavious Street, B.J. Hill, Justin Jones were all players that he coached at NC State that played in the NFL. Then he joined the Saints in 2017, and that was also not probably coincidentally the year that the Saints defense went from a very bad unit for several years to a very good unit. Made a big leap from 28th in DVOA in 2016 to 6th in DVOA in 2017, and they've been top 8 ever since then. And I'm not going to sit here and say it's all because of Ryan Nielsen. I'm sure he had a considerable influence on that. We know that they also made some major upgrades in the secondary with draft selections like Marshawn Lattimore and Marcus Williams, and those guys had a lot to do with the defensive turnaround. But, you do see a significant impact and improvement in the play of the Saints pass rush once Ryan Nielsen comes into the building. And that's kind of his background, which is known as this kind of D-line pass rush guru. And you see that reflected with Cam Jordan, who was a good player, established player, been a multi-Pro Bowler up to that point, But all of a sudden, he became a defensive player of the year candidate for the next couple of years, and not just a pretty good pass rusher that was getting, 7 or 8 sacks, an occasional 10 sack season, but a guy that consistently was one of the best and most dominant pass rushers and defensive players in the NFL for the next several years until this past year when Cam Jordan, of course, is now washed. But, that's not Ryan Nielsen's fault. And you see the Saints pass rush went from a unit in 2016 that had 30 sacks to a unit that had 42 in 2017. And every year since, they've had a 45 or more sacks. They've been one of the league's most productive pass rushes these last, 5-6 years. And again, I think a lot of that is owed to Ryan Nielsen's coaching. And, the question is going to be, if he's the defensive play caller for the Falcons, how much of that sort of, presumably hands-on experience coaching up these defensive linemen can Nielsen have for that unit? And so we'll just sort of have to see. But I think certainly you got to believe that the arrow was pointing up, and you got to believe that a big focus of some of the changes that we're going to see in Atlanta this offseason is getting back and focusing on that defensive line. And that's the thing I love hearing about this. And this is why, while you guys know, I've been saying for, over a week or two now that I didn't necessarily have, a horse in the race. But like, to me, it was less about what coach they hired and what scheme they brought in. It's about what the personnel changes they would make in order to facilitate that person's scheme. And I know everybody had their preferences: Vic Fangio, Brian Flores, Steve Wilkes, several other people. But to me, it wasn't like I was secretly pining for Ryan Nielsen, but I was like, hey, if Nielsen gets the job and he's the guy that no one's really talking about because he's the guy that doesn't have the experience, doesn't have the big name, but I'd be happy with that because it means we're going to focus on that defensive line and build that pass rush and build the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that we've been, pining for seemingly forever here in Atlanta. And so, like, that's why I like this move a lot for the Falcons. If they build a strong front 4, right? And that's not going to be the only things that they try to revamp here. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the schematic changes and potentially some of the personnel changes that Nielsen has. But I like this move a lot. One last tidbit on Nielsen's background, sort of reading an article about him, because he was ready, like, he's a young, ambitious guy looking to move up the coaching ranks. He was ready to leave New Orleans back in 2021. LSU under Ed Orgeron was ready to make him their defensive coordinator in 2021. Sean Payton calls him into his office and is like, no, you can't go. Like, you're still technically under contract. You're going to have to lawyer up if you're going to break your contract. I want you here. And he's basically telling him the story. And that Sean Payton, back in his early coaching career, when he was an assistant in Dallas, was ready to leave Dallas to become the head coach of the Raiders in 2004. And Bill Parcells basically like, no, this is a bad job. Stay here. You'll get your opportunity. And obviously Sean Payton goes on to become the head coach of the Saints 2 years later. The Raiders wind up hiring Norv Turner. They fire him right after 2 years, have Art Shell come in. It's a whole mess. And it's a similar kind of situation with Ryan Nielsen, where LSU, they fire Ed Orgeron midway through the 2021 season. It's a whole mess there. They bring in, of course, Brian Kelly and all that stuff. But basically, he would have been out of a job, within 9 months of taking that job. And now he's in Atlanta getting a better job than he would have had then, similar to what Sean Payton experienced. And now he's the defensive coordinator here in Atlanta. And obviously, presuming that he can, do the thing that pretty much nobody has done in a very long time, since basically the early years of Mike Smith, produce a quality defense here in Atlanta. He certainly will have his arrow pointing way, way up to potentially be, in the upcoming head coaching candidates in the near future. So, for a guy that's ambitious, he has his work cracked out for him, whatever that phrase is. I don't know, man. But if he can do that job, we may not have him long term, is basically what I'm getting at. But that means if we don't, that means that he's done a great job, right? That's basically what I'm getting at. So if he's the D coordinator for 2 or 3 years, that means that the Falcons defense made a similar jump to what the Saints defense did, 6 years ago, where they went from worst to first, essentially. But that could lead potentially to the Falcons, making a change at defensive coordinator, and that may matter because the Falcons are already making other coaching changes. 3 assistants are out the door with Nielsen coming in. And we'll see who Nielsen hires, or the Falcons hire to replace those guys, because one of those guys could be, Ryan Nielsen's handpicked successor in a world in the future where he goes on for greener pastures as a head coach. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll also talk about, some of these these ex-Saints free agents that will be available this March that the Falcons could certainly target to build that pass rush. That's the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I want to tell you guys about LinkedIn Jobs. And if you're a small business owner or hiring manager, you know that your success in 2023 all depends on the team members that you surround yourself, just like an NFL coaching staff. And that's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs, where you can quickly attract and hire qualified candidates by matching them with people that have the skills, the values, the experience that help you achieve your goals. And you can post your job for free in front of over 800 million members profiles to find the most qualified candidates. With LinkedIn Jobs, it's easy to screen and rate applicants based on your job qualifications all on one platform. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn is going to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So the Falcons part away with 3 assistants. That's D-line coach Gary Emanuel, outside linebackers coach Ted Montesino, and defensive backs coach John Hoke, right? We'll see what the Falcons do to replace those guys, but that's a lot of NFL experience walking out the door. Montesino and Pease were guys that go back many years. Hoke has a lot of experience. Gary Emanuel has a lot of experience. But we'll see if, this is because the Falcons want to give Nielsen, some leeway to bring in his own guys, and we'll see if he poaches some guys from the Saints staff or elsewhere. Or is this just Arthur Smith expressing that he was not happy with the play of the front, which, is under the purview of Emanuel and Montesino, and the secondary, which is under the purview of John Hoke. So time will tell on this. Obviously, if we hire some guys that, have connections with Nielsen, that's probably leading you the other way. If we hire other people or maybe promote from within, like a guy like Nick Perry, who I think is going to be coaching DBs at the Shrine Bowl this week, could be a guy that they could promote from within to be the new defensive backs coach. So we'll see how that goes. But, I think more importantly, going back to the conversation we've been having on and on over the last couple of weeks, which is like this D coordinator hire is less about the scheme, and we'll talk later about the scheme and some of the changes that we can expect to see, but it's really about the talent that we're bringing into the building, guys, right? Because, my long-standing statement and belief is that when it comes to defense, talent trumps scheme, right? You can run any, you can have any scheme or whatever you want, but if you don't have the talent to run it, then it doesn't matter, right? You can, play man, you can play zone, you can rush 4, you can blitz, all that stuff and more. Like none of that, and not to say it doesn't matter. I was going to say none of that matters, but it does matter. But it doesn't matter nearly as much as the guys that you have going out there and executing the scheme, because defense is always going to be about execution. You got to tackle, you got to fill your gaps, you got to cover that guy. Like it's an execution-based enterprise rather than a scheme-based enterprise, because defense, is always going to be reacting to what the offense does, and they're always going to be at a disadvantage, and you need talented players to be able to react quicker is essentially how it goes. And I used the analogy in the past about it's like sieging a castle, right? The defense is the defenders on the inside, the offense is the attackers on the outside. And if the attackers attack the front gate, you got to defend the front gate. If they attack the back gate, you got to defend the back gate. If they, attack both gates, you got to defend both gates, right? If they use ladders, if they, dig under the towers, they use catapults, you have to find ways to defend it. You have to find ways to defend it all. And that takes talent. And so that's essentially what it is. So, we're going to talk more and more about some of these guys, but you got to imagine you're going to see a revamp of this front seven with Ryan Nielsen. And that's been something that we have all been clamoring for several years. It's all about getting Grady Jarrett help. And I think we're finally going to get him that help this offseason. You got Marcus Davenport, you got David Onyemata, you got Shai Tuttle. These are probably the 3 big, Saints free agents on the front. We know the Saints are going to be up against the salary cap, so they're going to have a hard time, keeping several of these guys. Davenport, Onyemata, Tuttle were all guys that were already on my radar this offseason as guys that can come in. Obviously Onyemata, he's a little bit older side, over the age of 30, but a very productive, versatile interior defensive tackle, putting him next to Grady Jarrett and having those guys rush the quarterback, I think is exactly what you want. Davenport, had a down year in terms of sack production this past year. But I think Davenport's going to be one of those guys that could be sort of a sleeper free agent candidate because his history of getting hurt, right? I don't think he's played more than 700 snaps in any given season. I'm sure we can fact check that, but he's basically not played a full season his entire NFL career. And so because of that, I don't think NFL teams are going to go out there and pay him a huge premium type of salary in terms of guaranteed money because of that injury risk and that durability risk, not to mention, only having a handful of sacks this year after several other years. And so I think you'll be able to get him at kind of a prove it type of price. And whether that's, a 1 year, $5 million deal or 1 year, $10 million deal, 1 year, $12 million deal, or something beyond that, I think you're going to be able to get a really good bargain with Marcus Davenport to give yourself another dynamic and capable pass rusher opposite Arnold Ebiketie coming off of that edge and bringing a little bit more size to that edge rusher position that the Falcons, I think, are going to need. We talked a little bit about, Arthur Smith wanting to continue to incorporate more hybrid fronts, and so there's going to be a lot of discussion about 4-3 versus 3-4. I don't think you're going to see that much change on that, right? Maybe we lean a little bit more 4-3 than 3-4, but I think that actually kind of fits the personnel a little bit, being more of an attacking unit, allow Grady Jarrett to pin his ears back, David Onyemata, Marcus Davenport, Arnold Ebiketie, rather than sort of the more traditional 3-4 hold your gap sort of alignment. But we'll probably see a healthy mix of both. So I don't think that's nearly as big a deal, but those are the two prizes. Shai Tuttle is a very good nose tackle, not the biggest guy in the world, but I think it makes a lot of sense to bring him in along with Onyemata and Grady Jarrett, and you have Taquan Graham. So you have a really solid 4-man rotation on that interior in this unit. Other free agents like Kentavious Street, Tano Passigno are also free agents that could probably be had for very, very cheap. And I think both of those guys would be upgrades over Ade Ogundeji in this scheme. So we'll see if the Falcons bring those guys in. Another player to keep an eye on is Caden Ellis, right? And he had a very, very productive back half of the season, sort of playing that off-ball linebacker spot and getting a lot of sack production, playing that sort of downhill player. And given some questions about who's going to start next to Troy Anderson at inside linebacker, Caden Ellis, given the growth that he's shown, could be a prime candidate the Falcons go out in free agency and add to sort of, him and Troy Anderson would be a nice combination of bringing some of that pressure when, Ryan Nielsen does decide to dial those things up. But a couple of other ex-Saints that are going to hit the open market that are not currently on the Saints, but have played defensive line for the Saints the last couple of years under Ryan Nielsen. You have Mario Edwards with the Titans, Henry Mondo with the Giants, who was a restricted free agent, was on the Saints practice squad many years ago. Tyler Davison, our old friend here in Atlanta, now with the Chargers. Sheldon Rankins is another guy with the Jets. Taylor Stallworth with the Texans. And then you have T.Y. McGill, who's not a Saint, but did play under Nielsen at NC State, and he's with the 49ers, bigger body in the middle of that defense. And, moving away from the defensive line and talking about some of these free agents, we've been sort of eyeing Jessie Bates as a potential guy, especially given the expectation that, if you're going to play a certain type of scheme and you're going to need a single high safety, Jessie Bates is one of the best, center fielding safeties in the NFL. But now you kind of look at his teammate in Cincinnati in Vonn Bell as maybe a better fit for what the scheme is going to be, because you're not going to necessarily see as much of that single high looks in this defense. So I think Vonn Bell, now it kind of shifts our attention to Vonn Bell as opposed to Jessie Bates. If you're watching this weekend's AFC Championship game and paying attention to these Bengals safeties as potential options. And we'll talk about what those schematic tendencies are that Nielsen may bring to the table, because he may be basically porting Dennis Allen's scheme from New Orleans. And we'll talk about what Dennis Allen did in New Orleans these last several years and what those schematic changes and tendencies that he may bring over to Atlanta. But the NFL playoffs are here. You're going to be watching those championship games. And, you may want to put some action on those games. And if you do, why not check out the number one sports book in America. That's FanDuel, our new partner here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And if you're new to FanDuel, it's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. New customers, if you join today, you can get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. All you got to do is sign up at fanduel.com/locked on, and you can check out this weekend's action and bet on some of those games like Chiefs Bengals, like 49ers Eagles, and you can do so on the app where it's safe, it's secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at fanduel.com/locked on. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So we're going to wrap up today's episode talking a little bit about Dennis Allen's scheme, right? And we're going to be looking at like Football Outsiders and a couple of tweets from Matt Bowen, who I think still is working for ESPN. It talks about different coverage tendencies, and that, that goes back to a conversation that's been ongoing here on this podcast for several years now, that when you talk about defensive schemes nowadays, it used to be for many, many years, it was the two types of defenses you play with 3-4 versus 4-3. And nowadays, because so many teams incorporate these hybrid fronts that use, the strengths and weaknesses of both schemes and sort of incorporate them together, the differences between schemes is really about what coverages you're running, what type of zone coverages you're running, how much man coverage you use. Those are the things that differentiate between scheme. And then obviously, blitz rate is probably much more integral than what type of front you have, because everybody's blitz. It used to be like 4-3, you didn't blitz. 3-4, you did blitz. Then Jim Johnson, the late great Eagles defensive coordinator, sort of came around like, we're 4-3, but we're going to blitz a ton. Greg Williams was another guy where we're 4-3, but we're going to blitz a ton. So that's changed a little bit. So going back to that point about hybridization, but let's talk a little bit about Dennis Allen's scheme, right? Because we're imagining, given that Ryan Nielsen doesn't have a ton of background, doesn't have a rich background of being a defensive play caller, he's probably going to borrow from the NFL scheme that has been very, very successful, especially these last 5-6 years in New Orleans. And the thing about Dennis Allen's scheme is it's a lot of man coverage, right? You look at Football Outsiders, they had the Saints number 2 in man coverage percentage in 2021 and number 1 in man coverage percentage in 2020, right? So a lot of man coverage. Are going to play, 40% or so man coverage, which is a high degree in the NFL. But what differentiates the Saints from most other man-heavy teams is most man-heavy teams play cover 1, right? Which is a single high safety parked in the deep center field. And again, Jessie Bates fits that idea. But what the Saints do is they play cover 2-man, cover 5, whatever you want to call it. But they've been leading the NFL consistently these last couple of years in terms of 2-man coverage. They still play a decent amount of cover 1, but their primary, or I wouldn't say their primary man coverage, because they still play majority more cover 1 than cover 2, but they're still playing a far higher degree of cover 2-man than your average NFL team. And so that means that you're going to have 2 split safeties, right? And man coverage underneath, right? But what that does is it tends to, because if a team spreads the field and has 5 receivers, running back, a tight end, 3 receivers, on a pass play with 2 high safeties, you have 5 guys underneath to cover all 5 of those receivers, right? So that means you're only going to rush 4. And that's kind of the thing with Dennis Allen's scheme, is he's not as blitz happy as some of these other potential coordinators that the Falcons could have hired, like Brian Flores, like Steve Wilkes, right? They're going to rush 4 the majority of the time. But the Saints are very selective when they do rush 5 or do rush 6, right? And that's led to guys like Demario Davis and Caden Ellis, who we were talking about earlier, getting a lot of sack production. That when they do bring that pressure, they do love to bring that second level pressure from one of those linebackers, and having a Caden Ellis, having a Troy Anderson, having a Michael Walker or Rashaan Evans, all guys that arguably are probably better blitzers at this point in their careers than necessarily coverage guys, makes a ton of sense. So it does kind of fit with what the Falcons already have, but can continue to build upon with those downhill linebackers that can be not only thumpers in the run, but also can, run through those A gaps and blow up running backs in the backfield to get that pressure, on the quarterback. The other thing that's interesting about the Dennis Allen scheme is they incorporated a lot of dime, right? I believe that in both 2020 and 2021, looking at the Football Outsiders numbers, they had both the fifth highest usage in both of those years, with about 25% of their defensive snaps coming out of dime coverage with six defensive backs, in the field rather than your standard nickel. They still run nickel like 60% of the time. But that is something that's interesting. And that's interesting for the Falcons because that was one of the things we talked about at the end of the season with Isaiah Oliver. Like Isaiah Oliver would be a great nickel back because he can do not only the corner stuff, but also incorporate a little bit of that safety stuff. And so if you have, say, a Richie Grant and a Vonn Bell on the back end, and you have Isaiah Oliver and a D. Alford, along with, AJ Terrell and whoever the Falcons bring in, opposite him, which I don't think is going to be Casey Hayward. This move does seem to signal that the Falcons probably will part ways with Casey Hayward. And, it's funny because I recorded an episode Friday evening as I'm recording this, shortly an hour or two before recording this. When the news broke, I was, recording an episode to basically bank for next week, headed to the Senior Bowl and preview. Then I'll probably still put that episode up. But at that time, I didn't know who the Falcons defensive coordinator hire was. And there was a listener question that I answered on that. And he basically asked me, like, if the Falcons don't go D-line in the top of the draft, what other positions do you think they will go? What other positions would you go? And I basically explained on that episode that I think the Falcons are going to take a corner in the first round. I put out a mock draft on Friday night on my Twitter that basically had the Falcons taking Devon Witherspoon, the Illinois corner. And I think it's probably, before this hire, I probably thought I would have guessed my betting, shooting my shot, trying to, have lightning strike twice with, nailing the AJ Terrell pick back in 2020, but doing it, that was like 2 days before the draft. Now, like 3 months before the draft, trying to shoot that shot. I think it's probably going to be Christian Gonzalez or Devon Witherspoon, right? And it makes a lot of sense given the man coverage. Witherspoon graded out really highly in terms of his man coverage this past year. Christian Gonzalez is kind of your classic 6'2", 200 plus pound, press man corner that typically gets drafted in the top 10. So there's going to be some conversation about the Lions at 6 taking a corner, because they certainly could find another guy opposite Jeff Okudah. And I certainly think the Falcons, especially if they lean hard on pass rush in free agency, as I think they probably will, we'll take a corner at the top of round 1 at 8, and we'll see whether it's Witherspoon, whether it's Gonzalez. I think both of those guys fit, but Witherspoon probably gives you a little bit more value in run support as well as zone. So we'll see how that goes. But other sort of schematic tendencies that we may see Nielsen bring to the table, very little cover 3, right? And that's kind of where I think you kind of move off of Jessie Bates a little bit, because you're not going to have that single high safety nearly as much. Like the Saints have consistently been at the bottom of the league in terms of cover 3 usage these last couple of years. They don't use a ton of cover 2 either. They use a lot more quarters, right? Relative to the rest of the league, I should say, right? That's the thing. Like, these are relative. Like, I think Matt Bowen posted back in 2020, I think it was, the Saints were 12th in cover 4 usage, 27th in cover 2 usage, and 30th in cover 3 usage. But I want to say, like, they still use a higher percentage of cover 2 and cover 3 than cover 4. I want to say, like, they only use cover 4 like 12% of the time, but because most NFL teams don't use that much quarters, like I think like the Falcons may have used it, like, I don't know, 3% of the time or something like that. But you get what I'm saying. So we're going to see cover 2 and cover 3, but relative to most NFL teams that are running those coverages like 20-25% of the time, the Saints typically are much well below that number. So those are going to be some of the schematic shifts that we're going to see in his defense. And so finding those 2 split safeties, they're going to play a lot of man coverage, finding that other cornerback opposite AJ Terrell that's going to be able to lock down in the high percentage of man coverage, I think is going to be a priority this offseason. That may be something the Falcons decide to address in free agency. I don't think it's going to be Eli Apple, another former Saint, but we'll see about that. And then obviously revamping that defensive line. So happy to hear the Falcons finally got their guy in Ryan Nielsen. Certainly a guy that, comes from a Saints defensive scheme that's had a lot of success these last couple of years. Obviously, not a particularly experienced defensive coordinator, but he's an ambitious up and coming guy. Several other teams have been looking at him as a defensive coordinator. The Vikings were certainly looking at him during this coaching cycle, and I can't recall who else interviewed him, but clearly a guy that's has the arrow pointing up as one of these up and coming young coaches, and hopefully the Falcons can catch him and ride those coattails as this defense ascends, over the next couple of years. So excited that we finally got this news, and now we can get excited about all the players that we're going to bring here into Atlanta over the coming months. So that's going to do it for us here, guys, for this emergency Friday evening, Saturday morning pod. As many of you guys are listening to it, we'll be back on Monday. I'll probably re-record that episode and just change, some of the answers now that we know who the defensive coordinator are, or maybe edit it a little bit. And then we'll obviously next week we'll be talking all Senior Bowl guys. So we'll be keeping an eye on some of those guys that will be down at Mobile on the front and in the secondary that could be helping us out in Ryan Nielsen's scheme. So there we guys go. I hope you enjoyed Locked On Falcons as your first listen. Whenever you're listening or watching this, make sure you check out Locked On NFL, as well as Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves for your second listen, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.